A tall tale is an unbelievable story which contains elements of exaggeration. But writing a tall tale is not as simple as over-exaggeration. It is easy to make a story unbelievable, but an unbelievable story is unlikely to engage your audience. The trick to writing a good tall tale is to make your exaggerations improbable rather than impossible. Quite simply, to make your tale unbelievable in a believable way.
The tall tale is never about you. If you're the narrator, you're not the one who is bigger than life.
There are 4 common principles that contribute to making an unbelievable tale believable: consistency, implication, extension, and progression. Consistency is the internal logic of the story. Everything must make sense in the context of the story.
He took 2 old ovens, cut the end off of each one, and welded them together. Then he extended the concept to 3, then 4, and finally 5 ovens, end to end.
Implication is the art of not saying something. Let your audience fill in the details.
A big Midwestern thunderstorm blew in, and black clouds started swirling menacingly above.
The last 2 principles, extension and progression, are closely related. Extension is the act of leading the listener on the journey from probable to improbable. Progression is building up large improbabilities from a sequence of smaller improbabilities.
But my dad always operated on the principle that more is more, and he put in 10 times as much yeast as the recipe called for. The dough in the red-hot oven began to swell up like a balloon.
The purpose of a tall tale could be moral, satirical, humorous, or fantastical. But what makes a tall tale is that it is improbable and ultimately unbelievable. A successful tall tale will lead the listener through a believable sequence of improbable elements to establish a magical moment in time when disbelief is suspended. When you step up on the stage to tell a tall tale, you are being given the power by your audience. It is your responsibility to create that magic moment when you have brought the unbelievable to life and changed disbelief to wonder.
That was good. Now that's a loaf of bread. That's what my father said the first time he saw one of these. And that got my ultimate handyman father to thinking. Clearly, a loaf of bread like this could not be baked in a conventional oven. How could he make an oven that could bake a loaf of bread this big? That's when the experiment started. He took 2 old ovens, cut the end off of each one, and welded them together. Then he extended the concept to 3, then 4, and finally 5 ovens, end to end. With an oven like that, he could bake a loaf of bread almost 3 meters long. But while he made the oven longer, he didn't make it deeper or taller. So he wasn't really baking giant loaves of bread. He was baking giant breadsticks. It all probably would have ended there if my father hadn't run across this book one day, How to Build Your Own Earth Oven. My father realized that with enough bricks and the right kind of clay, he could build an oven big enough to bake a loaf of bread the size of which the world had never known. That loaf of bread would have been taller than me, twice as big as this stage, with a little left hanging over the edge. The oven needed to make a loaf of bread that big would be 4 times that size. My father looked at our backyard, and he knew there wouldn't be enough room. So we bought the empty lot next door. He ordered 16,442 bricks to make the foundation for the oven. He brought in 12 dump trucks full of 8 different types of clay, sand, and gravel to make the ceramic dome of the oven. After 5 months of work, he was ready to bake. He ordered a dump truck full of flour. He emptied the neighbor's swimming pool and used it as a giant mixing bowl. To knead the dough, he covered it in plastic, put it in our driveway, and drove over it 672 times with his car. As the dough was rising, he heated the oven until it was red hot. He used a forklift to lift the dough into the oven. Now, my dad was a handyman, but he wasn't a baker. A real baker knows that with yeast, less is more. But my dad always operated on the principle that more is more, and he put in 10 times as much yeast as the recipe called for. The dough in the red-hot oven began to swell up like a balloon. And just then, like in a bad fantasy movie, a big Midwestern thunderstorm blew in, and black clouds started swirling menacingly above. The hot red glow of the oven reflected off the bellies of the clouds. The dough now filled the oven completely, pressing outward against the dome in all directions. In between claps of thunder, you could hear the oven groaning under the pressure. Just then, the rain began to fall. The ice-cold raindrops hit the oven with a mighty hiss. A bolt of lightning ripped across the sky, striking the dome of the oven. The dome exploded outward. Fiery, flying bricks fell out of the air like lava from an angry volcano. Breadcrumbs the size of basketballs knocked people to their knees. Windows were cracked and broken 10 kilometers around. It took us months to fill in the crater and rebuild our house and the neighbors' houses. My father recovered from his physical injuries, but he never quite recovered his spirit. But in our family, we like to think that for one moment, for one single, shining, trembling, glorious moment, as the walls of the oven exploded outward, there sat a loaf of bread. A loaf of bread the size of which the world had never known.
My name is Kavita Shah and I am a member of the Women's College Toastmasters. We have just learned about what a turtle is and seen an excellent example from Dr. Dean Schultz, our area governor. Let's take some questions from the audience.
The concept of the tall tale comes from an oral tradition. Can you tell me what form the tall tale has taken in modern times?
Thank you, Dr. Christine Coombe, our division governor. Tall tales take many forms now. One place that I like to go is the music of Johnny Cash. He and other folk singers like Harry Chapin and the Highwaymen, which he was one of the Highwaymen as well, but all of those men told these kind of tales, used a lot of tall tales and tall tale elements in writing their songs. The best example from Johnny Cash is the tale of John Henry. If you search that on the YouTube or the internet, you can find it. And he uses also, interestingly, some musical elements that you can't use on stage in any sort of competition. The repetitive elements that sound good in a chorus, but wouldn't sound good in a speech. Other areas are lots of short stories. And the trouble with short stories, there's great short story writers like Patrick McManus, who's from America, North America. He writes stories about hunting and fishing and the things involved in that. The trouble with these stories in this sort of competition is that we're in a multicultural environment and we don't share necessarily the cultural background of hunting and fishing like I do, because that's where I grew up. That's very common. So they're inspirational in terms of writing, but very hard to transfer directly to an audience in Dubai, for example. Lots of children's stories, of course, and akin to that, the children's animations, very tall tale oriented. Graphic novels and comic books. I use the example of Spider-Man in an article I wrote. Spider-Man, Superman, all of these are tall tales. Now, I don't really believe that superheroes are good tall tales for a contest, generally speaking on stage, but they work very well in the comic book format. A couple other things. Oh, action movies. I was listening to a conversation about some of the people actually talking about Bollywood movies the other day, about how everything's so unbelievable and everything. But Bollywood has really taken the tall tale and extended it to action movies, the kind of Sylvester Stallone, like 500 enemies against one guy idea, and other things. And Hollywood has done the same thing with action movies. Now, the thing I don't like about Hollywood and other movies is they've taken the mythic quality of tall tales and they've made it commonplace. Every action movie goes far beyond what's actually possible now. And so what we used to talk about in mythology, like the story of Achilles, for example, has been trivialized by the overuse of these things in Hollywood.
As a follow-up to that, Dr. Dean, can you tell me what elements of your tall tale will be understandable to every culture in the room here in Division F?
Well, I think it's difficult to find a cultural element that goes across all cultures. Bread, fortunately, is one of those. They have bread of some kind in all cultures. Now, of course, I took a chance with this kind of bread, yeast bread, because many cultures have a flatbread culture. So talking about yeast and the thing growing may not connect with everyone. So I think the important thing is to build your story internally so it is consistent. So when I talked about, for example, the ovens, putting two ovens together and then extending that, and then when I talked about the masonry oven, the ceramic dome oven, I don't have to talk about how you can make it bigger to the size you want. I've already put that concept in people's mind about conventional ovens. So you just try to keep the story internally consistent with as much information as you can share to keep everybody on the same page.
Thank you, Dr. Dean. Now my next question to John.
Mr. Dean, what are your tips to people who want to write a tall tales speech?
I think there's four things I really need to talk about here. First is, remember that a tall tale is a story. So any tall tale you write has to include those good storytelling elements you would put into any story. The second thing is to use the four principles that we just talked about here in this demonstration. And keeping in mind probably the most important one for multicultural audience is that internal consistency, as we just talked about. And this is something I see all the time, and I don't really like. The tall tale is never about you. If you're the narrator, you're not the one who is bigger than life. You're a normal person in every way. You may be involved in the situation that's part of the tall tale, or maybe somebody you know, but you really need to think in terms of you're narrating a story, you're not playing a part. You don't have Spider-Man and then turn into Superman and then so on. Somebody else is doing all that. And finally, think beyond people. It doesn't have to be the people who are over-exaggerating. Something about the situation and so on. There was nothing in this story about the loaf of bread that where my father was unusual. What was unusual was the size of things he created and the effects of what happened. So think beyond people. It's not just people who can be over-exaggerated.
Now my third question to Clayton.
Dr. Dean, can you describe for us the thought processes you went through in drafting the tall tale that we've just seen?
Actually, I can't. In a way, these things just sort of materialize from a number of elements. The one thing I had in my mind, first of all, again, was that I'm in a multicultural place, so some things I talk about, I will need to add context or they won't be understood by the audience. But from there, you have to remember that anything can make a good story. From there, I guess I would say the only other thing was I wanted to capture a modern tall tale tradition. I didn't want to make kind of the old mythic sort of tall tale. I really had in mind writers, as I said, like Patrick McManus, who can write incredibly funny stories. And in just like 2 or 3 pages, just rolling on the floor laughing. But do it in a way that could connect with my audience here. And I didn't really want to make it a humorous story either. Because tall tale contests are not about humorous speaking. Great. Add jokes, that's important. But you can have a tall tale that it'll have people crying. And traditionally, if we look at, say, who did I say before? Johnny Cash. John Henry. There's nothing funny about John Henry. Search John Henry on YouTube and you'll see many different versions. And interestingly, tall tales grow in the telling. So if you watch and listen to one John Henry and then another, you'll see that it grows and they add elements every time. It's quite interesting. But I think that's really what it is. Choose kind of where you want to come from. Choose a good idea and just build on it. How did I come up with my father building a giant oven? I don't know. I like to bake bread. My father was not interested at all. That's all not real. But it turns into a good story.
So your father was not a handyman?
My father was a handyman. That's the element that's true. I'm sorry, that's the element that's
Okay.
true.
Okay.
So I can't imagine him, if my mother had said, I want an extra long oven, I can see him taking 2 old ovens and cutting the ends off and putting them together. And he had the skills to do the electrical things and everything, and the welding. He knew how to do all that kind of stuff.
Okay.
I don't, and that's really something I regret in my life, that I didn't spend enough time with my father to learn that things. But that's the kernel of truth there. And this loaf of bread, you can buy them at Waitrose. That's the 2 things that were true.
Thank you, Dr. Dean. And I'm very sure that, like me, you must be all excited to join our next turtle contest. See you then.
Perfect. Good.
Is there anybody hungry?
You dropped that on the floor too many times.
Yeah.
Cut cameras.
This is gonna rock.
Are you ready?
Okay, go